Before we introduce our speaker, I wanted to just say a few words about the subject matter of the conference, since I am not able to attend much of it. But I spent much of my career as an American diplomat focusing on Europe, so this is my part of the world that I care a lot about. When one is looking ahead, as this conference is doing, it's a good idea to look backwards first, as I'm sure you've been doing. And I was looking back just about a little over 2 decades ago when I was on the National Security Council staff in Washington at the end of the Cold War as Director for European Affairs. As that Cold War came to an end, there was no conviction more widely held in the upper reaches of the U.S. government that the United States had to remain in Europe in every sense of the term. And from that judgment, and this was certainly the most closely held judgment of the President Bush 41, the first President Bush, and Brent Scowcroft and James Baker. And their judgment then was to accomplish this, NATO had to survive the disappearance of the threat that it was formed to counter in the first place. The NATO über alles sort of point of view made some sense at the time, but it had the ironic and maybe even tragic effect of insisting on an institution whose very existence made it almost impossible to bring about the transformation in Euro-Atlantic or transatlantic relations that was intended by the administration of the time. So NATO's existence ironically prevented the very reforms that were needed. Then the relatively benign security environment of the 1990s made it possible pretty much to sort of go on with the inertial force that these institutions pretty much have. So NATO meetings would occur, sort of with underlying hollowing out of the institution masked by the sugar-coated rhetoric of NATO communiques, of which I helped draft a few, I have to admit. This was all true up until the transatlantic crisis over Iraq in 2002 and 2003. So let me now flash back to that period. In late 2004, the U.S. National Intelligence Council, during the period that I was chairman, produced an unclassified report that some of you may be familiar with called Mapping the Global Future. It looked out to try to imagine the forces that would shape the world out to the year 2020. It was the result of a year-long series of conferences on 5 continents, and it was an interesting report methodologically and substantively. Among its other findings, the report foresaw the possible fracturing of the Eurozone and even of the EU itself unless European leaders came to grips with fundamental structural reforms, which we considered unlikely. It's a fairly commonplace observance now in late 2013. It was heretical in 2004. I know that because when I briefed the report in Paris and then at Davos at the World Economic Forum, it was seen by some of my European friends as being extremely unfriendly to the European project, which was not the intent. It was really trying to imagine what was going to transpire in Europe, and I guess the prophecy was all too accurate. It's worth underlining that those findings were made well before the global financial crisis, which accelerated the Eurozone crisis but did not cause them. That crisis was caused by fundamental structural issues, which I'm sure you've already discussed this morning, and many of you around here know far better than I did, namely that the European Union adopted a common monetary policy and common currency, but did not build fiscal union. So states could no longer devalue their currencies to compensate for lack of competitiveness, especially with the German economy. And there was no central authority to keep countries from deficit spending. So these and other factors have brought us to where we are now. Looking forward, one can imagine several scenarios, actual fragmentation of the Eurozone or even of the European Union itself, a new burst of integration, that is the aspiration of some, muddling through sort of crisis management to prevent the worst disaster, but not really grappling with the underlying structural realities, or a multi-speed Europe. There's probably others, but those are the 4 that occur to me. I won't try to predict which is going to happen. I know what I hope will happen is a continued strong European Union, because the stakes are very, very high, as high for Americans as for Europeans, although Americans tend not to know this. we've gotten so used to and have taken so much for granted the advent of a peaceful, prosperous, cooperative Europe that we've failed to even imagine what a renationalized Europe might tend toward. The stakes, to my mind, are higher than the future of China, and Americans need, as they're pivoting to some other part of the world, ought to take a glance back at Europe to make sure we're keeping track of that. So I think the core conviction at the end of the Cold War was right, even though the implementation has been flawed, namely that the transatlantic relationship was as vital in this new era as it was in the last, and great imagination was needed to make the transatlantic relationship relevant and contemporary for a very different set of 21st century challenges. So with those brief remarks, let me ask my colleague Yanis Varoufakis to come up and introduce our speaker. Yanis.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Bob. We are all very grateful, especially Professor Galbraith and I, and for your personal support, and also for the support of the LBJ School, for putting together this fine audience with a view to throwing some much-needed light on the ongoing European crisis. A few days ago, the US Treasury Department, in its response to Congress, correctly, in my view, drew attention to the ill effects of the current European Union policies, and in particular the exportation of recession from the core of Europe to its periphery and, more broadly, globally. Now, my task today is an easy one. It is to take up the uncommon privilege of introducing you to Mr. Yves Leterme, the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. Mr. Leterme is especially qualified to address this audience and to illuminate our proceedings for at least two good reasons. The first reason is that he happens to be at the top of the major international organization concerned with global economic affairs and governance, which has uncommonly demonstrated a determination to embrace radically new ways of thinking about our economies. Under the leadership of Angel Gurria and Yves Leterme, the OECD has broken ranks with a pretty sterile consensus that effectively ruled out crises like the ones that we have been experiencing over the last 5 years on both sides of the Atlantic. The OECD's readiness to embrace new ideas and fresh approaches, which both Professor Galbraith and I have had the experience of living through in Paris with Angel Gurria and many other people in the OECD, constitutes a breath of fresh air. We are all looking forward to a whiff of that breath of fresh air from Mr. Leterme today in our humble Texan gathering. Now, the second special qualification of today's esteemed keynote speaker has to do with his origins. Yves Leterme, despite his French name and his impeccable French, from what I hear, rose to prominence as the leader of Flanders. I believe Minister-President is the official title, before becoming Belgium's foreign minister, a position that led in a few short months after that to 2 stints as Belgium's prime minister. Belgium, as we all know, is not just at the epicenter of the European Union. In a sense, it is a microcosm of the European Union, a supranational, trilingual coming together of peoples that relies on bonds not so much of kin, language, even a common enemy, but of shared principles and common values. A coming together that is often problematic, even infuriating, as I'm sure Mr. Leterme could testify to, but a worthy coming together nevertheless. With this rich background at the forefront of Europe's and the OECD's attempts to make headway in stemming the crisis that engulfed us all after 2008, 2009, 2010 and counting, Mr. Yves Leterme is exceptionally qualified to address the irony of a continent that began uniting under many different languages and which ended up almost on the verge of disintegration, or being divided by a common currency. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Yves Leterme.
Aristopoli. Thank you very much, Mr. Varoufakis. Dean Hutchings, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thank you for your kind introduction. I would first of all like to pay tribute to the organizers, to Mr. Galbraith and colleagues that took the initiative. I think that every initiative to bring together knowledge from the United States, this side of the Atlantic, and Europe, to better understand each other, to better understand the real policy challenges, is worth taking. And I was thinking about that yesterday afternoon when struggling against the jet lag, which is the task of every OECD top official, to always be struggling against jet lag. I went to a restaurant and I had a very nice, good, typical Texan steak. And I was talking a little bit afterwards with two waiters. I think they were not really students, but they were still young. And I was asking themselves what they knew about Europe, what they knew about Belgium, what they knew about Flanders. And in declining order, the result was, let's say, less and less substantive. It was really a lesson in humility. And I was talking about the euro was even worse. And so I think that really every effort we pay to learn to know each other and to improve the knowledge on both sides of the Atlantic is very, very important, especially about a subject which is of concern for us all. And before I begin, let me forward you the best wishes and the warm memories of Angel Gurria, the SG, who's very active, as you know, and who couldn't make it today. A couple of words about the OECD. Believe me or not, but the OECD was really founded on the basis of a convention signed the 14th December of 1960. I have to underline this because there was some doubt earlier this morning. I was born the 6th of October of 1960, but there is no interference between the two events of 1960. And the event the colleague attended was the 50th anniversary, which was logically or not in May 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here. It's a great pleasure, a real honor. Although, of course, I wish the topic which gathers us today was a happier one, was a more optimistic one. And so I would like to share a couple of thoughts, and I would like to warn all people listening here and other places in the world through the broadcasting that I am struggling between the obligation to represent the OECD and to tell you what the vision of the OECD is. But if you allow me, I will elaborate a little bit on some aspects from the point of view of what I would call a practitioner of the financial crisis during the years 2008 till 2011, where I had the honor to represent my country at the European Council. Dear Mr. Varoufakis, Mr. Holland, Mr. Galbraith, in, and I quote, a modest proposal for resolving the Eurozone crisis, version 4.0, you pointed out very rightly that our Eurozone crisis is in fact composed of four sub-crises: a banking crisis, a public debt crisis, a crisis of underinvestment in the economy, and now a social crisis. And on behalf of the OECD, but also on behalf of, let's say, the political spheres in Europe that have been charged during the last 5 to 8 years, I must say that you are very right. This is the right description of what we are facing. We agree that the current system, in the long run, is really not sustainable, and that sometimes it equals to a snake biting its own tail. And I would even dare to say that we as policymakers, as politicians, we kind of got it wrong, although I think you must also concede, I'm really not convinced that it could have been better, the approach we had, that it could have been better than it was until now. But anyway, we need to fix the vicious circle in which the Eurozone finds itself trapped, and we need to make the necessary institutional and structural reforms to place the system on a sound footing and reinvigorate inclusive growth. Before entering into the subject, let me warn you, I'm a convinced pro-European citizen. So whatever I will tell you in the following 10 to 15 minutes, you have to take it with this part of salt, I would say, grain de sel, like they would say in French. Indeed, I'm pro-European, and that's the reason why I say that the European Union, the European integration, including having a common currency with 17 countries in Europe, is probably the most positive development of the last 70 to 80 years on that continent, on that part of the world. Indeed, I think it prevented all kinds of conflicts. Besides that, there are also very positive developments. For instance, the euro is quite a strong currency. The Eurozone is growing. Latvia is joining us. So not all is so negative. And then the question is, can the Eurozone be saved? I would answer, of course, yes. And I would even add that it has been saved already. I referred to it earlier this morning in a question to our Greek colleague. I'm really convinced that the decision that was taken the 7th of May, Friday 7th of May 2010, when we were sitting together with the heads of state and government, and we had to decide on behalf of our country if we would show solidarity with Greece, and when we decided to say yes, that was the real historical turning point of the euro. Since then, whether we want it really or not, but since then we are engaged in a process, and there's a point of no return which was reached. I concede that that decision was not always based for all people sitting around the table on only economic arguments, even not on all the kinds of analysis and assessments we made this morning, and very clever analysis and assessment, but it was a political decision. And so I would like to add that for that reason, we still have to keep in mind that the euro as a currency, to belong or not to the Eurozone, to stay or not in the Eurozone, is also a decision, a process which is, in a very important way, a process characterized by politics. It's a political currency for a part. So can the Eurozone be saved? The answer is yes. And so I told you, but I suppose that there's still some doubt in the room, so I will try to elaborate. Let's first look at what happened during the last 5 years, because I think, notwithstanding all criticism, lots of decisions have been taken already. Indeed, in the past 5 years, European authorities at all levels have taken significant measures to correct the fiscal, the financial and external imbalances that led to the crisis, and to reinforce fiscal and financial institutions. The work is not perfect, of course not, and it is not corresponding to some more extreme positions. But anyway, lots of decisions have been taken and have corrected these imbalances and strengthened reinforced institutions. And these efforts seem to at least partly be paying off, with financial market conditions improving and signs that economic growth is returning. Of course, major challenges remain. The outlook for growth is very uncertain. Public debt and unemployment remain too high. And moreover, which is more important, the agenda for structural and institutional reform to ensure long-term productivity growth, competitiveness, and more economic growth, substantial economic growth, remains unfinished. To guarantee the stability of the Eurozone in the long run, of course, lots of more positive developments have to happen. Indeed, the uncertain political situation, and I'll come back to that, social tensions and continued unsustainable public finances in some vulnerable countries mean that financial markets could still be unsettled. And I think, having listened very carefully this morning to the whole of the debate, this is really a factor, and believe it from the side of a practitioner, which is underestimated. The behavior of the financial markets. when you're leading a middle-sized country, top 20 economy in the world, with quite a high debt, a high level of debt, with 2 to 3 systemic banks, 2 to 3 out of 4 systemic banks at the brink of failure, well, I can say that the spread means something. That looking hour after hour at what the spread is between the German interest rate for German sovereign debt and your sovereign debt, it is very concrete. And so that you are forced sometimes to act not only on the basis of, let's say, more theoretical approach. But anyway, financial markets could still be unsettled by what happened or what was not decided until now. The main risks are insufficient progress in establishing institutions and rules that ensure effective functioning of European banks, failure, very important, to achieve adequate asset quality reviews and stress tests and to clean bank balance sheets based on these tests, and insufficient progress on structural reforms in debtor and creditor countries. However, once again, it is important to underline that the picture is not that dark globally, so to say that it could also have been worse. This morning, comparison has been made between the different sequences of a crisis like we went through during the last years, the comparison between our crisis, so to say, and the crisis of the 30s. And I can see you really can see the same, you can make a parallel. We have the same stages, we have the same parts of the crisis, the same sequences, but I think, globally spoken, that the reaction until now of the societies as a whole and the policymakers more specifically is more effective and is better than in the 20th century. So to ensure a sustainable, from a political and social point of view, and balanced recovery, policy actions on several fronts are still needed, both at the national and European levels, and I think we could regroup them under 4 agenda items. First, the financial sector. There are still persisting vulnerabilities that have to be addressed through further financial reforms, including the establishment of a banking union, but then a real banking union made up of a real common supervisor with strong power, exhaustive and inclusive resolution mechanisms, and appropriate fiscal backstops. Number 1, financial sector. Number 2, dealing with fiscal issues. No doubt the efforts until now to bring down debt to GDP ratios, well, these efforts need to continue. However, they must be designed in a more growth-friendly way, provide the impetus for getting the jobless back to work and mitigate structural unemployment and inequalities. I'll come back to that. Third, growth-enhancing structural reforms, including more efficient tools as these that are used until now to address rising inequalities. Indeed, boosting growth is critical to tackling the unsustainable high joblessness, especially among the youth, and high government indebtedness, which calls for further important structural reforms in labour and product markets, as well as to strengthen investment in human capital and innovation. That's the third category. The fourth, and it has been happily already addressed this morning, very important also, is urgently rebuilding trust before it is too late. I would like to elaborate a little bit on these 4 aspects now. First, the financial sector repair. It's fair to say, just to see facts, that the balance sheets of lots of European banks still need to be looked at carefully. And overall, financial tensions and financial fragmentations may have lessened in the euro area, and there, of course, the positive role played by the European Central Bank should be underlined, recognized, as well as the progress, as I said before, in external rebalancing and restoring competitiveness, fiscal consolidation and steps forward in reforming the European Union banking sector, which have all contributed to improved risk perceptions. But anyway, however, much still needs to be done. And this is a very important contrast, of course, between the situation in the Eurozone and what happened in the Eurozone during the last years and what happened in the States in 2008 and after 2008 and European Nordic states in the early 90s, indeed, the Eurozone, the European Union, has been very, very slow to deal with banking sector weaknesses that were revealed by the crisis. This has been enabled partly by weak stress tests, potentially also in some countries forbearance by national supervisors susceptible to political pressure. But I would say the most important point, the lack of real common answer to the banking problem. It was a kind of sauf qui peut, they say in French. Each country working out solution on its own. In that field, I remember, I think it was October 2008, we, at the beginning of the whole of the process, the crisis, the banking crisis, the outburst, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the acting president of France, gathered us. Well, he organized an informal meeting at the Élysée. I think we were the 17 Eurozone member states, but also Gordon Brown was invited. I'm talking like about history. Gordon Brown was then leading the UK. No, I underline that because I will come back to that point. The meeting where we decided the loan to Greece of 110 billion euro was attended by 17 heads of state and government, out of which only 2 are still leading their country. So in 3 years' time. But I'll come back to that when I talk about the political impact. Anyway, the meeting in October 2008, we were sitting in the Élysée, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and we were just at the outburst of the crisis, and we had quite an informal exchange of views on how to tackle the crisis. And as Benelux heads of state and government, well, heads of government, with Jean-Claude Juncker and Jan-Peter Balkenende, we had a little meeting before the meeting to see if we had a Benelux statement. That was also related to the fact that we had some banks in troubles, which were with mixed shareholdership from these 3 countries. And we decided to propose to argue a common approach, a common Eurozone approach of what was then happening to some of these systemic banks in some countries. Anyway, banks that related to their turnover were too big to fail, but also too big to be saved by one single country. I remember a Sunday afternoon that I have to guarantee loans of banks, of a Belgian bank, up to 220 billion euro, Belgian GDP being, I think, 330 to 340 billion euro. So this was, of course, a kind of decision. This was, of course, a kind of guarantee, which was, in fact, a burden too high to be supported by one single country. And so that was one of the reasons why, with a mandate of the colleagues of the Netherlands and Luxembourg, I took the floor, after all other colleagues, and I asked for, can we sit together to urgently find a common answer to the crisis? I was not the only one. I don't want to rewrite history. But the answer there, very honestly and very, it was, I don't make a process of anyone, was there, well, we don't have time, we're not prepared, it's not the moment, it's too risky. And I went back to Brussels that Saturday evening, and Sunday I was sitting at the table in my office, and I had to solve once again alone as a Belgian Prime Minister the problems of Belgian banks that suffered of what happened here in the States with the Lehman Brothers. But anyway, that's I think one very important element, the lack of timely common answer to what was happening. And the slow reaction, of course, has contributed to the slow recovery and fragmentation of the financial system. I think in 2013, this might explain at least in part the different growth speeds in recent years on both sides of the Atlantic. Indeed, healthy bank balance sheets are crucial to support the potential economic upswing and long-term growth with the funding of what is very specific for the European economy, amongst others, of small and medium-sized enterprises in Europe relying heavily on bank credit, more so than in this country than in the United States. Anyway, determined action to strengthen the bank's balance sheets and establish a banking union, a real banking union, to reduce fragmentation is thus called for. This means in particular that the bank stress tests and asset quality reviews that are scheduled for next year, for 2014, by the ECB need to form a real solid base for real decisions, to recapitalize or resolve banks if necessary. For this end, of course, a common efficient resolution mechanism needs to be put in place, and we have to solve lots of problems which remain on the table, like the moral hazard problem and others, along with resolution mechanisms, along with adequate fiscal backstops that are able to mitigate the risks that could arise if private sector bail-in became necessary for bank recap, for bank recapitalization. So there's a lot of work to do in this first category of measures in the financial sector. The second issue is addressing fiscal issues. And of course, you can say that this is not the most important aspect, that it calls on austerity, and that austerity is non-productive in the given circumstances. On the other hand, once again, the refinancing on a daily basis of sovereign debt is a very practical issue a government has to face. And it's a very practical issue even in terms of wealth, in terms of the income of ordinary citizens. I'll give you one example. When you take the difference in interest rates of Italian sovereign debt and German sovereign debt, and you take the cost of this difference during the last years, and you compare it to all the budgetary and efforts the people have to pay in the form of more taxes and less income in Italy, you have nearly exactly the same amounts. So the Italian citizens have paid a lot, and there have been a lot of measures to cut in the budgets and so on, and the whole of the sum of that money was just enough to pay the financial markets, to pay the people that invested in Italian debt at an interest rate higher than the German one. So it is important to continue to address fiscal issues. So on one hand, fiscal consolidation delivers results. Indeed, for the first time since the outburst of the crisis, debt-GDP ratios are about to stabilize in most of the euro area countries, owing to substantial consolidation efforts in the last 2 or 3 years. But however, in a number of countries, current debt levels are still much too high, unsustainable, and refinancing is really too expensive. And the task is to take the last necessary steps in strengthening government budgets further and maintain strong budgetary positions thereafter to reap the benefits of past consolidation, where the trend is the most important for the OECD and not the actual rhythm on a year-to-year basis. At the same time, of course, fiscal consolidation and structural policies should focus more on sustainable and inclusive growth and job creation. In particular, reform in the education, the health sector, pension systems should rank high on the policy agenda, and there is scope for large consolidation gains without compromising equity or service quality. So on the one hand, fiscal consolidation delivers results. On the other hand, fiscal governance, of course, is still to be strengthened, but is already strengthened. The failure to meet the fiscal target set under the EU rules in the run-up of the crisis reduced the credibility of the common rules. And in response, several multilateral agreements have been concluded. We've been talking about this morning, like the six-pack, the two-pack, and so on. So this is about addressing the fiscal issues. Where it is important to underline also, I think, when we are talking to American friends, that the European Union and the Eurozone is still what I would call a federation under construction. And indeed, there are lots of weaknesses in that construction. For instance, the fact that whenever you meet on a Thursday evening as a European Council, and people are watching, and markets are watching what you will decide, that the day after you have to have a decision unanimously taken, or even during the night before the markets open, with these people sitting around the table, a consensus, everyone has to agree unanimously, and this is not the most easy governance structure one could imagine. And I already referred to the fact that on an ongoing basis, this crisis is consuming lots of political credibility. I refer to 2010. 17 of the heads of government since 2010 have been replaced, and we still have the European elections of next year to come to see what impact on a political level this can have. Third element, we think honestly a little bit underestimated until now, is that we have to tackle in a more efficient way the growing inequalities and the pressure on the social cohesion. Growth has also the growth during the last decades has failed to reduce income gaps in the European Union, in fact, since the 90s. I won't elaborate, but we have a Divided We Stand report at the OECD, which clearly shows that even in periods of very important economic growth, our systems add to social inequality, or on the other hand, don't improve social cohesion. And of course, since the beginning of the crisis, income inequality has widened. Structural reforms can help to address or avoid what the OECD calls the false austerity versus growth dilemma that is currently keeping advanced economies policymakers awake at night. We have made some concrete country-specific reform proposals, how to fight unemployment and support the economy's potential to grow. In most cases, what is needed is a mix of labor market, product market, and educational, very important educational vocational training reform that strengthens labor force participation, resource reallocation, and productivity growth in the medium term. This is the most urgent task, we think, for national governments, especially governments of countries which have very high unemployment figures. These figures are unsustainable, and it is really calling for urgent action in that field. We face the very exceptional situation that most of the long-term unemployed people as of today in Europe are in fact young people. That's really in a very exceptional situation. That's the reason why we advocate really very intensely to these governments and countries to invest when they reduce their deficit, to save money to invest in vocational training programs, in labor force participation, and so on and so on, where it has to be clear that it takes more public money to bring someone back to the labor market than to keep people in unemployment, sometimes with some subventions or help from the public purse. Last but not least, fourth point of interest of growing importance, rebuilding trust. Rebuilding trust is really critical. I must say not only in Europe. When you look at the monitors, the opinion polls and so on, there are lots of countries, including the United States, where the trust in the policymakers and in governments is, so to say, let's be open, is not the highest possible. I was watching television yesterday, and there was a lot of items were about the Medicare problems with the computers and so on. I can imagine that ordinary citizens of this country are really asking themselves, well, what is it all about? My personal rights on health insurance are endangered by the non-functioning of computers. So I think in terms of trusts, we don't have a monopoly in Europe of having problems with citizen trusts in governments and policymakers. There are all kinds of barometers that report that only at this very moment 15% of the people surveyed trust that government leaders, and I quote a question, can solve social or societal issues, while only 14% trust that these leaders can make ethical and moral decisions. And the perception of the European institutions is even more dramatic, as a growing number of EU citizens see them as a source of problems rather than part of the solution. And we've been talking about this morning the rise of populist or xenophobic political parties in nearly all the EU member states should be taken very seriously. And of course, in this respect, the European elections of May 2014 will act as a crucial test. To restore this trust, reforms aimed at restoring the growth potential of our economies, but an economy which is developing in a sustainable way, including social cohesion, improving social cohesion, taking measures not to damage the social fabric, are really essential, or really key. Let's not lose sight of this important social imperative, which is a precondition for ensuring public support for an ambitious reform agenda. We have to be very careful not to be in a situation where one of the most important bodies of the European Union would partly be composed by people opposing the European Union. I've been leading a country where partly the country was questioned, the fact itself of a country was questioned by almost 30 to 40% of the membership of the parliament. And then it is very difficult to act as a government, to act as a majority. Besides the fact that you always sit together with the same people to form a majority, because you're the only ones that are left that are willing to form a government, which makes it very difficult to make a difference between policies, which is essential to put forward a real distinction in terms of policy people have to make up their minds for and choose for. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. In conclusion, many of you are, of course, familiar with the remark by the so-called Don Berwick, the CEO of the Commonwealth Fund in the United States, and I quote him, "Every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the result it gets." Well, I think this is really right for the European Union. Indeed, the Eurozone is the sole and simple result of political decisions European leaders have taken over the years, let's be frank, over recent years. And of course, I'm not blindly advocating for always more power to the European institutions, but how can those institutions fulfill effectively their core missions when they are not given the tools and legitimacy to do so? The tools in terms of money, of power, of policy power, and in terms of decision-making power. You may know that the functioning costs of the EU equals to an average of 15 euros per year per citizen. The rest is redistributed to the EU citizens through the structural funds and a number of other financial instruments. So a maximum of 1 GDP point. That's the whole of the budget of the European Union. How can we blame a system which only costs the price of a good pizza, even in Texas here? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Varoufakis, I will quote you again in your book, The Global Minotaur, and I quote, "Thus the crisis is constantly metamorphosing, taking its toll differently in different places. This is no longer a financial crisis, this is not even an economic crisis, it has become a political crisis." I think, once again, you're right. I said it before, the European integration, the Eurozone is maybe the most positive achievement of policymakers, of political elites since the Second World War, but it deserves and it needs a new range of political decisions, courageous political decisions, of course based on a good economic assessment, economic analysis, like we've been debating this morning, but moreover, the European Union and the Eurozone needs political leadership and political will. Thank you very much.
I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone in thanking profusely Mr. Leterme for the whiff of fresh air which I had predicted would blow across this room during his talk. It is an LBJ school tradition and strength, this combination of analytical rigor and personal stories from policymakers who were at the helm of leaky vessels during times of storm and tumult. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, just in order to end up on a lively note. So is there any brave soul that would like to follow up with a question or 2? We have one from Professor Thamaidis and another one from Professor Rafa. Let's have both questions, and then Mr. Leterme can answer them together.
I would like, thank you very much. It was very interesting, your presentation. I would like your personal perspective, not necessarily as the OECD representative. How fragile do you think the Eurozone is? Do you think there is any scenario where one country leaving the Eurozone would not lead to the entire Eurozone collapsing?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last part.
If one country were to leave the Eurozone, do you think there is any scenario in which the entire Eurozone would not unravel.
And let's have the second question from Professor Rafa, and then you can answer both questions.
Thank you very much for your very interesting speech. I have one question. You talked about solidarity with the Greek. Now, I would like to ask whether you can explain a bit more in detail what you meant by it. Because apparently, if so much money was given in solidarity to a small people, then the circumstances of living standards, etc., must have increased. So, but of course, if the money did not really go to the Greek, but was rather solidarity with, say, creditors or banks and so on, then it would be explicable that the situation in Greece is now as it is. And what I wonder is why another step was not taken. Very early on, people from the financial sector, such as Mohammed El-Erian, or, for instance, the chief economist of the Deutsche Bank in those days, Herr Mayer, were proposing a haircut of 50%, which they wrote, Mayer, for instance, wrote, that would not be such a difficult thing for most creditors because quite a few of them had already acquired Greek instruments on the secondary market. And I would like to know why, in the face of advice I could go on with other bankers, of the banking community itself, did the EU politicians decide to take another way and to do something which in many jurisdictions is called delaying insolvency, and which will lead inevitably sooner or later, to a loss of taxpayers' money that had been used to delay this insolvency in Greece. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. First of all, the question of the PSI, of the haircut. In the first stage of the crisis and the first range of decisions we took to so to say, help some countries, Greece and afterwards the other countries, there was an enormous fear amongst other member states of the Eurozone, which also had an important public debt, or which also had banks which were affected by the impact of Lehman Brothers, that the access to the market would be very difficult for them, and that introducing even the discussion of a haircut would lead to instability on the financial markets and would endanger the access to capital for banks and endanger the possibilities to refinance the sovereign debt. That was the very practical argument. And of course, you have to see also that, I said it before, when you meet, not when you meet a Friday afternoon, but when you meet Thursday evening, and the markets open in Asia at 10 Greenwich time or at, well, you have to have a solution during the night. It's not always difficult to negotiate and to be very tough in negotiations to reach an agreement. Also given the fact that amongst the own group you represent, you always have to have the agreement of 17 people representing their country. You have to see this in a very practical way, how European democracy is functioning. Of course, you have the European bodies like the very specific European bodies like the European Commission and the European Parliament. But this European Council, me, myself and other colleagues, we went to Brussels. Well, for a Belgian Prime Minister, it's quite close to the door. But you go to the European Council, and before that you had a public debate in your own national parliament about a mandate on the basis of which you go to the European Council and you negotiate on behalf of your country on a communiqué, on a decision, including whether you will engage in negotiations on a PSI or not. So I don't know if you understand that this is, of course, a kind of transparency which is very normal to a democracy, which conflicts with the behavior of financial markets. And we had the first discussions, the first exchange of thoughts about asking the private sector to, well, forcing the private sector to take a part of to pay part of the bill, so to say. The first discussions in that field were very difficult because of the fear we had of the impact on the behavior of the financial markets. And I must say that afterwards we had a European Council where we decided to engage in a PSI, the first one. It were very tough negotiations. At the end, there was a result. It was not an ideal result, but also that council was really at the brink of being unsuccessful, and that would have been an enormous failure for the European decision-making process. So don't underestimate the complexity of the European decision-making process. I've witnessed a colleague from a Central European Eurozone member state that said at 1 o'clock in the night, at 2 o'clock in the night, at 3 o'clock in the night, sorry, I don't agree, I don't have a mandate. If I go back to my capital with an agreement on this, I'm not a prime minister anymore for the weekend. Finally, the country said yes, and happened what was said. The colleague prime minister was sacked by the parliament because there was well, the decision was not really what the mandate was that was given by the national parliament. Democracy, European democracy, is really very complex. Yeah, to unravel the whole of the Eurozone, I really go back to what I said in the introduction of my remarks. The 7th of May the 7th of 2010, we really reached a turning point, and we decided to engage in a process to save the euro, whatever it would cost. Later on, I think Mario Draghi used quite similar words, whatever it would take. And I think this was the most important decision, and this means also that everything will be done to have unless of course a country would have the clear will to leave or but in all other circumstances, I don't think that there is. You can imagine a situation where a country leaves and the whole of the Eurozone is unraveled. Really, May 2010 is, in that perspective, a really historic moment. We've been engaging ourselves to defend the Eurozone, whatever it would take. The euro, whatever it would take. I forgot the second question. You had two questions? Or if someone had?
I thought you had answered.
Okay, fine. That's the moderator.
Which was complicated, no doubt, and I'm glad you explained so detailed. There was the ruling law for the Eurozone, Article 125, the no bailout clause, which was apparently violated.
We had, yes, but we had lots of opinions by the legal services and so on, and I think it's fair to say that we infringed a little bit on what was literally in the treaty. That's right, yeah.
Well, on this occasion, on this ancient Greek note, since Antigone was the first one to claim that a bad law needs to be violated, a round of applause for Mr. Yves Leterme.